Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade number 18. I can't believe we're already up to Symphony number 18. This is an amazing piece. Haydn told his biographer, he said, in considering my works, he said, there are some good children and some bad children, and every now and then a changeling has crept in among them. Well, Symphony number 18 is one of those changelings. It is an extraordinary piece of music, completely and utterly original, unlike anything else by anyone else. It is so typically Haydn in its way, but what makes it typical is its uniqueness, its originality, its conceptual daring. This is a three-movement symphony scored for what was Haydn's normal orchestra at that time, just two oboes, two horns, strings, a bassoon, maybe a harpsichord continuo on the bottom if you want to throw one in. That's it. But the sound of it is just amazing. But what's even more amazing is the structure. Normally, Haydn's symphonies in three movements, which is what this is, have a typical fast, slow, fast pattern. If it's a four-movement symphony, it's usually fast, slow, minuet, fast, or if it begins with a slow movement, the so-called church sonata symphony, and we've talked about those, such as Symphony number 5, for example, that's the first of them, then it's slow, fast, or slow minuet, slow, fast, or there's some sort of, arrangement, but they're pretty standard. Well, this one isn't like any other symphony Haydn wrote. This is slowish, fast middle movement, minuet finale. So that means that the first and last movements are actually, they're both in moderate tempo because the opening is an andante. And let me tell you exactly what it is here. I have the little bookie here and I can tell you what it is. There we go. It's an andante moderato. And the minuet is a moderate tempo dance. So basically, the outer movements have the same moderate tempo, and the middle movement is a really zippy, fast allegro, or presto, or something. It's very quick. Very, very quick. And what's so amazing about this, beyond just the arrangement of movements, is how they all relate to each other. Because Haydn connects everything, but he connects them in his usual way. That is, not with shared themes, but with shared ideas, things, musical chunks and rhythms and objects. It was amazing what Haydn did with music because he was the only guy doing it. I'm telling you, there isn't anybody who did what Haydn did at the same time with music. And we're talking the 1760s. Maybe by now we're up to about the mid-1760s. No one's really exactly sure what the date is. This could have been the late 1750s. But in this symphony, you're going to hear some interconnectivity and also expressive growth, which is really, really extraordinary because the formal stratagems that Haydn employs are always connected to what the music expresses and how it's going to express it. And in this particular symphony, because the form is so unusual and so special, I can explain or illustrate what those things are with musical examples very, very easily. And that's what's just so wonderful about this piece. So we're going to have lots of musical examples, and let me just find out who the musical examples are by. I get so excited talking about these things. I don't even remember who the performers are. This is so amazing. Number 18. Okay, we're with the Toronto Chamber Orchestra, as opposed to the Toronto Camerata, whatever that was, under Kevin Mallon on Naxos. These are very, very good performances, by the way. And this symphony particularly can be a little tricky because it does rely on some intelligence on the part of the interpreters to show you how all the parts relate to each other more clearly. I mean, this is also one of those tests for whether or not your performance really understands what the music is, because you can just do like a period instrument thing and play it all real fast with a teeny tiny orchestra and blur all the details, and then you don't get to hear all the wonderful ways in which the various parts interrelate. In this performance you can, which is really delightful. So let's start by talking about the first movement. Now, this slow movement, you can tell, is a first movement slowish movement and not an internal slow movement, because Haydn's internal slow movements in all of these symphonies do not have woodwind parts. They're scored usually for strings only by means of contrast. But in this movement, the full orchestra participates right from the start, and so we know that this is actually intended to be the opening movement. Now, the form of this movement is what we call sonata without development. In other words, it has a first subject and a second subject tonal areas. These are the home key and then the subsidiary key. And then those two things simply repeat. But it's just so typical in musical terminology. Sonata without development doesn't mean there's no development. It means it's all development. It's just that the development happens in different places. There's no section called a development. The development is the repetition of the original music. It's an enriched repetition. It's a developed repetition of that music. So I don't need to play you anything other than the exposition of this movement, because once you hear it, it will tell you everything you need to know about what's going to happen in the rest of the movement, and you can listen to it yourself and enjoy the way Haydn elaborates the ideas that he presents initially. But I want you to listen to it. I'm not going to tell you what to listen for immediately. I want you to just hear the exposition. So let's listen to it, and then I will give you a few clues that will point you on your way to this particularly marvelous voyage of discovery. Here it is. Charming, delightful music, right? Now, what are some of the things that you will have noticed in listening to that? First, there is the dotted rhythm of the tune. That's ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. That kind of rhythm is called a dotted rhythm because of the way it's notated usually. And that's very, very important. Remember that rhythm. Dum, bum, da-da, da-da, da-da. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. It couldn't be simpler, right? Now, you don't think about this exposition in terms of first subjects and second subjects, do you? You really think of it in terms of a sort of walking, nonchalant, breezy kind of dum-ba-dum-ba-dum dotted rhythm tune with interruptions. It's interrupted by stuff that sounds like it's just popping out of nowhere, loud, fortissimo or forte interruptions. And the last one of them is in a minor key. And it's really quite startling. It comes seemingly out of nowhere, and it's stabbingly dissonant and kind of shocking, isn't it, when you get to the end? And I'm going to play you now the exposition all over again. I want you to listen to the dotted rhythm, and I want you to listen for that outburst at the end, which has three stabbing chum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, chum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, cha, like that. And keep those things in mind as this discussion continues. Anyway, here is the exposition again, and give it a good, careful, thorough listening. So I'm sure you heard what I was talking about. And now you can listen to the first movement, the whole symphony, at your leisure, and we go on to the second movement. Now, the second movement is the quick one, and it too is a sonata form without development, which is remarkable for a fast movement. Usually they have developments. And so I'm going to play you the entire movement. It's in two halves, both are repeated. I'm going to play it straight through without the repeats so you can hear how the whole thing goes. The important thing to keep in mind here is that you noticed at the end of the exposition of the first movement, there was that odd minor key outburst. Well, you're going to hear an odd minor key outburst here, a different one. But it's an outburst or an unburst, if you want to call it that, because the outburst in the first movement was that. I mean, it's basically a quiet movement with a loud boom interruption at the end. In this case, because the movement's basically loud and fast, the minor key interruption is soft and slower. Either way, it's isolated, and that's the point. Haydn wants you to hear it as something special, so he makes it the same thing, that is a minor key thing, a minor key object, and he puts it in the same place, formally, in the movement, the very end of the exposition, and you can't miss it. I'm going to put a little superscript over it anyway, just so you'll hear it when it comes. And pay attention to that one too, because that one is also particularly interesting. Listen to the little two-note sniglets that you'll hear in it. It goes da 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 da. Just listen to those things, those little two-note sniglets. Those are going to become very important as well. So, here we go. Fast, wasn't it? And racy. But it is also a sonata form without development, like the first movement. Now, this formal identity suggests something to us. And the location of the minor key outburst in the same place also suggests something. Could it be that Haydn is actually working with variations of some of the same thematic ideas between these various movements? Turns out I wouldn't have brought it up if the answer was not yes. You're not going to hear, when you listen to the opening, the same tunes that you heard at the beginning of the first movement. But the shapes of the melodies are similar. A melodic shape is simply it goes up, it goes down, it goes up and down and up and down, it goes sideways. It has a similar rhythm, it has similar harmonic tensions distributed through it. There are many ways where melodies develop family similarities without being literal repetitions of each other. And every main tune in this symphony is related to the main tunes in the previous movements in that specific way. In fact, you can tell just from the way each movement begins. It begins with an initial gesture. The first movement was a little falling, bum, bum, and there's a pause. Ba-dum, 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 it went on. In the fast movement, this middle movement, it's yump, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. There's a thing and a pause. Now the finale is a minuet. And that minuet is going to begin exactly like the second movement did, with a bwomp, and then it's going to continue. So we know that Haydn wants us to hear this sort of family resemblance. It's vague. It's not something that's terribly specific. It's not something you need to hear the first time around. It's something that rewards you the more you listen to the symphony. So really, technically, what I should do is a talk that says, Symphony number 18, and then stop. And then let you listen to it a few times, because every time you do, you begin to hear more and more of the inevitable process that binds the piece together. And if this symphony has an emotional object, it's the fulfillment of the threat of the minor key interruption. In the first movement, there was a major minor key interruption. In the second movement, there was a major minor key, and it said major minor, important, let's call it, an important minor key interruption, both in the same place. But the minuet presents a problem. And Haydn's solution is so ingenious, it's so brilliant, it's just extraordinary. I don't understand why people are not writing doctoral dissertations about the sophistication of thought that went into this little tiny 13-minute symphony, because a minuet is a dance with an A-B-A pattern. And so it's not in sonata form. Eventually, as Haydn developed them, the A section became more developmental. But especially at this stage in his career, the minuet was the minuet. His symphonic minuets, as I've already explained in previous talks, can't really be danced to. They can be very sophisticated in terms of phrasing and rhythm and tricky and things that would be guaranteed to trip up some real dancers. But it's still a minuet. And the basic form of the minuet is the basic minuet, A, B, A. Well, this one does that, but it also fulfills the destiny of the entire symphony. And it does it in a way which is just so bloody marvelous. Remember the two things I asked you to remember from the first movement: the dotted rhythm, the minor key outburst, which we also heard in the second movement. So this minuet is going to start just like the second movement did, but its main theme also contains that dotted rhythm from the first movement. Remember that? I'm going to play you the opening of the first movement, and then a little pause I stick in, and then the opening of the minuet, just the opening phrase, and you'll hear very, very clearly the relationship between the two of them, purely in terms of rhythm. Forget the tune for the time being. The tunes are, in a sense, variants of each other, but you may or may not hear that, and it really doesn't make any difference. You may hear it only in terms of the fact that one sounds sort of, kind of vaguely like the other, because they're in the same key anyway. But listen for the rhythm, that bump, ba-dum, ba-dum, and you'll see immediately that Haydn has not forgotten where the music came from. Here you go. Now, you heard that immediately. I know you did. It was very, very simple and very delightful. So, yes, that dotted rhythm occurs in the minuet, but only momentarily, only for a moment. Haydn isn't quite ready to tell us exactly how dependent on that first movement this minuet is going to be. It has its own themes, it has its own form, it has its own business, it has its own character. He doesn't want to reduce or eliminate the contrast just to prove that one thing can sound like the other. That would be a cheap trick. No, no, no. Because with Haydn, the symphonic concept is that the music will evolve to show how it's related to something else. So that is the A section, and I'm going to play you the whole movement in a minute. But now we come to the central section called the trio, or the B section. Now the trio section is the fulfillment of that minor key outburst that we heard in the first movement and in the second movement. And what's so marvelous about it is that it consists entirely of elements that we heard in those two previous outbursts, only they're arranged in a slightly different order. Because Haydn can't just have, as he does in a sonata movement, a section in a minor key that lasts for just a few bars. Here, it becomes an entire central episode, really almost an independent movement with its own independent form. It's an A-B form, both sections repeated, just like the main section of the minuet. And so you'll hear both, remember the two-note sniglets? That's the beginning of this minuet. It's doo-doo, doo-doo, it's those two-note sniglets followed by those three jabbing dissonant minor key things from the first movement. Remember that cha da 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 cha da 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 cha? Well, that is the main theme of the trio section of the minuet. That's how Haydn builds it. And my God, it's extraordinary. So what I'm going to do now is I want you to listen to all three minor key outbursts. We're going to hear first the one in the second movement because that's the order in which it occurs in the minuet, in the trio section of the minuet. So first the second movement, then the minor key outburst in the first movement, and then the theme of the trio that Haydn builds out of those elements in the minuet. And I put little pauses between them so you can hear them all individually and have a second to savor each one. Here is how that idea evolves throughout the symphony. Okay, right? So there you have it. And now that little threat of minor key disturbance has become an emotional, beautiful, lyrical, painful maybe, pensive, fully realized emotional moment in the symphony. It's just marvelous. But Haydn isn't done with us yet. Because when the minuet returns after the trio section, normally the minuet returns once through without any repeats, and you just play the whole thing and then the music stops. But Haydn adds a coda. He adds a final farewell to this minuet, and he makes sure that the players can't get it wrong, because if you look at the score, normally after the trio section, you'll see a little note that says minuet da capo, means from the top, from the head. And that means just go back and play the minuet again, normally without repeats. Sometimes they write senza repetizione, without repetitions or without repeats. But in this case, Haydn writes the whole minuet out again, without repeats, straight through, beginning to end, and adds the coda. So that way, you can't possibly mistake his intentions. And that's why you have to hear the entire movement. I'm going to play you the entire movement. But first, I want you to hear the coda, because it is in the coda where we get to hear the return of that dotted rhythm. That's what the coda is, a final celebration of the dotted rhythm from the first movement that comes back to round off the whole symphony. We heard it a bit in the minuet. Haydn deliberately kept it understated because he didn't want to be that obvious. He was saving it. Listen now to the coda and listen to that wonderful little dotted rhythm. There you go. There you go. The symphony has come fully round to a happy ending based on the initial the initial idea after a very, very substantial excursion into a minor key. So this is a finale symphony. In addition to all of its other marvels, classical symphonies are not finale symphonies. That means the weight of the argument is in the finale. Normally, classical symphonies have the most sophisticated movement intellectually first, and they progressively relax. And we've listened to many, many of Haydn's zippy, fun-filled finales. But this minuet is not only as long as all of the other movements, but it is, by a wide margin, the most emotionally probing, the most expressively deep, even though it is the most formally simple. That's what's so cool about it. That's the paradox at the heart of this symphony. Haydn puts the greatest weight in the finale, which is, in every possible way, the ultimate realization of all of the ideas that we have heard so far. It is so fulfilling. It's such a gratifying ending to this symphonic journey. It's so emotionally satisfying. What an incredible, incredible piece of music this is. So now I want to play you the entire finale. It's about 4 minutes long. And you've got to hear the whole thing because you have to hear the series of repeats and the way Haydn toys with them in order to create a movement of sufficient weight to completely balance out and, in effect, fulfill and provide the culmination of the entire symphonic journey that is Symphony No. 18. So here is the total finale, start to finish. An incredible, incredible piece of music. Now the only thing for you to do is to listen to the entire symphony. You really do, from beginning to end, and just let it wash over you. You've heard all of these bits and pieces. You've heard how they all fit together. Now you have to hear what Haydn actually does with the entire work in the correct order, with all of its parts in their proper place. And you will be amazed, because this feeling of satisfaction that this music gives you is really, really just something very, very special. I hope this talk gave you some pointers as to what to listen for and why I think this symphony is so amazing. Haydn never wrote another one like it. Haydn almost never repeated himself. In fact, he never really did repeat himself. The forms recur over and over again. But the way he uses them? Nah, never. So keep on listening, folks. Come back for number 19 in the Haydn Symphony Crusade and tell your friends about this one. Boy, this is just an incredible piece of music. I dare you to find anything else that's even remotely similar from this period. Haydn never ceases to amaze. Take care.